The fires had been burning for 3 days. Not the kind of fires that kept villages warm through bitter winters, nor the kind that baked bread in stone ovens or forged steel in blacksmith furnaces. These were fires of annihilation. Fires built from the bones of a dying species, fed by royal decree and stoked by the trembling hands of soldiers who told themselves they were only following orders. Pyres, dozens of them, line after line across the courtyard of King Aldrich's fortress, each one stacked high with leathery, iridescent eggs that caught the light like jewels even as the flames licked at their edges. Sapphires and emeralds and deep, impossible amethysts, colors that no human artisan could replicate, colors that had inspired wonder in every generation that had walked beneath the shadow of dragonkind. Now those colors blistered and popped and dissolved into black smoke that curled upward like the mournful fingers of the dead, reaching for a sky that would never again see dragons ride its currents. Commander Bryce Harlow stood at the edge of the carnage with his hands clasped behind his back, and his jaw set so tight that the muscles in his neck stood out like ropes. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and weathered by 37 years of military service that had carved deep lines around his gray eyes and salted his dark hair at the temples. His armor was dented and scarred from campaigns along the northern border, where the kingdom's enemies were tangible and his purpose was clear. Here, standing amid the destruction of something that had existed long before his kingdom had even been a thought in some conquering warlord's mind, his purpose felt like ash on his tongue. "Commander," the voice came from behind him, clipped and efficient. Lieutenant Sira Voss approached with her helmet tucked under one arm, her reddish hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. She was young, too young, Bryce often thought, to carry the weight of what she'd been ordered to carry these past 3 days, but her blue eyes were steady and her spine was straight. She had the look of someone who was holding themselves together through sheer, stubborn willpower. The eastern clutch has been brought up from the caverns. 47 eggs, the men are waiting for your word. Bryce closed his eyes. 47. He could remember when the number of eggs found in a single nesting cavern would have been cause for celebration, for festivals, for the dragon keepers to light ceremonial lanterns and sing the old songs that honored the bond between humankind and the creatures that had once been their greatest allies. Now 47 was just another number on a tally sheet. Another stack on another pyre. Another entry in the ledger of extinction that King Aldrich was so determined to balance. "Commander," Sira pressed gently. "Have them brought to the pyres," Bryce said, and the words tasted like broken glass. He did not watch as the soldiers carried the eggs out of the eastern tunnel. He could not. Instead, he turned his gaze to the fortress walls, where the banners of House Valdris snapped in the wind, gold and crimson, the colors of a dynasty that had risen to power on the backs of dragons and had now decided that those same dragons were no longer useful. The irony was not lost on Bryce. It sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and indigestible. King Aldrich Valdris IV had ascended the throne 7 years ago upon the death of his father, a man who had been content to maintain the ancient pact between crown and dragon, a pact forged in fire and blood during the founding war, when humanity had been little more than scattered tribes cowering in caves, while the Velrathi Empire stretched its shadow across the known world. The dragons had chosen humanity then. Had offered their fire, their flight, their fierce and terrible loyalty in exchange for something that no other species had ever thought to give them: respect. Not worship, not subjugation, not the careful manipulation that the elves practiced or the fearful servitude that the dwarven clans demanded. Simple, uncomplicated respect. For 800 years that pact had held. Dragon and human had fought side by side, built cities together, raised families that intertwined both species in ways that the purists on every side found deeply uncomfortable. The dragon riders had been the kingdom's greatest warriors, their bonds with their mounts so deep that when one died, the other rarely survived long after. Bryce had grown up on stories of those riders. Had dreamed, as a boy, of standing in the saddle of a dragon and feeling the wind tear at his face, while the world spread out below him like a painted map. But dreams, as Bryce had learned long ago, were fragile things, and kings had a way of crushing them beneath the weight of practicality. The problem, as Aldrich had explained to his council in a speech that Bryce had been unfortunate enough to witness, was that dragons were no longer necessary. The kingdom had cannons now, walls of stone reinforced with steel, standing armies that numbered in the tens of thousands. The Velrathi Empire had crumbled into scattered principalities that squabbled among themselves over territory that no one else wanted. There were no great enemies left to fight, and in the absence of an external threat, the dragons had become something far more dangerous to a ruler who valued control above all else. They had become a threat. Not because they were aggressive, dragons by their nature were remarkably peaceable creatures when left unmolested. They did not raid villages or hoard gold or any of the other foolish things that old legends attributed to them. They were intelligent, deeply emotional beings who formed familial bonds as strong as any humans, and who grieved with a ferocity that could shake mountains. They sang to their eggs in voices that resonated through stone, and they cared for their young with a tenderness that would have seemed impossible in creatures so large and powerful. But they were powerful. That was the sin that King Aldrich could not forgive. They were powerful and they were not his. They answered to the Dragon Keepers, an ancient order that predated the monarchy itself, and they obeyed no law that conflicted with their own deeply held sense of right and wrong. A dragon could not be bribed, could not be threatened, could not be manipulated with the subtle webs of politics and patronage that Aldrich wielded like weapons. A dragon looked at a king and saw not a ruler but a human, fallible, temporary, and ultimately unremarkable. For a man like Aldrich Valdris, that was intolerable. And so the order had come, sealed with the king's signet and delivered with the cold efficiency of a death warrant. All dragon eggs were to be destroyed. All adult dragons were to be driven into the wilderness beyond the kingdom's borders. The dragon keepers were to be disbanded, their lands seized, their knowledge scattered to the winds. And any human found harboring a dragon, egg, hatchling, or adult would be executed for treason against the crown. The purge had begun in the capital and spread outward like a stain. Bryce had been given command of the operation in the Eastern Territories, where the largest nesting caverns lay deep within the mountains. His soldiers, good men, loyal men, men who had followed him through battles that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives, had carried out their orders with the mechanical precision of a well-drilled unit. Eggs were collected, catalogued, and burned. Adult dragons were driven from their nests with arrows and fire, their roars of anguish echoing through the valleys as they fled into the unknown. The dragon keepers who resisted were arrested. Those who refused to surrender were killed. 3 days of destruction, and Bryce felt like a hollow shell filled with something black and rotting. He was pulled from his thoughts by a commotion near the eastern tunnel. Shouting, not the organized, disciplined shouting of soldiers executing orders, but something wilder, something edged with panic. Bryce turned. Syrah was already moving, her hand on her sword, her body tense. The soldiers who had been carrying the eggs from the eastern cavern had stopped in their tracks, forming a rough semicircle around something on the ground. Some of them had drawn their weapons. Others were backing away, their faces pale beneath the grime of 3 days' labor. "What is it?" Bryce called out as he strode toward the group, his boots crunching on ash and shattered shell. The soldiers parted and Bryce stopped. In the center of the semicircle, on a bed of crushed eggshell and scorched earth, was a hatchling. It was small, no larger than a hunting dog, and it was shaking. Its scales were a deep midnight black that seemed to drink in the firelight rather than reflect it, and its eyes were enormous, liquid gold, and filled with a terror so profound that Bryce felt it in his own chest like a physical blow. Its wings were crumpled against its body, still damp from the fluid of the egg, and its tiny claws scrabbled uselessly against the ground as it tried to move, tried to flee, tried to do anything other than lie there exposed and vulnerable before the creatures that had destroyed everything it had ever known. It had hatched. Right there in the middle of the destruction, this tiny, impossible creature had fought its way out of its shell and emerged into a world that was actively trying to kill it. And it was alive. Bryce heard the words before he fully registered that someone was speaking them. A young soldier, Private Eden, barely 19, with a face that still hadn't lost its boyish softness, was standing at the front of the semicircle with his sword half drawn, staring at the hatchling with an expression caught between horror and something that might have been awe. It came out of the shell," Eden said, his voice cracking. "Right there. I was carrying the egg and it started moving and then it just cracked open. I didn't know what to do, I dropped it and it just came out." Silence fell over the group. The hatchling's golden eyes swept from face to face, searching for something: safety, perhaps, or understanding, or the mother that it would never know. Its small body trembled violently, and from its open mouth came a sound that Bryce had never heard before but recognized instantly, on some deep and primal level that predated language and logic and everything else that made him human. It was a cry for help. "Commander," Syrah's voice was quiet, pitched for his ears alone. She had moved to stand beside him, and when Bryce glanced at her, he saw that her hand was not on her sword. It was hanging at her side, clenched into a fist so tight that her knuckles were white. Her face was carefully blank, but her eyes were burning. "The orders are clear. All eggs are to be destroyed. A hatchling is." "I know what the orders are, Lieutenant," Bryce said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. He looked at the hatchling again. It had stopped its panic scrabbling and was now staring directly at him. Not at the soldiers around him, not at the drawn weapons or the flickering pyres or the black smoke that blanketed the sky. At him. Those golden eyes locked onto his gray ones with an intensity that was startling in something so small, and Bryce felt something shift inside his chest. Something that he had been holding rigid for 3 days. Something that was groaning under the weight of obedience and duty and the numbing mantra of following orders. The hatchling made another sound, softer this time, almost questioning. And Bryce Harlow, who had spent his entire adult life following orders, who had marched into battles because his king told him to, who had burned the eggs of an innocent species because the law demanded it, made a decision that would change everything. "Don't touch it," he said. The words fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Ripples of confusion spread through the soldiers. Commander, Sira's voice was sharper now, edged with something that might have been warning or might have been hope. Bryce couldn't tell which. "I said don't touch it." Bryce stepped forward, placing himself between the soldiers and the hatchling. He could feel the heat of the nearest pyre on his back and the weight of every eye upon him. "The rest of the eggs go to the pyres. This one stays with me." "Sir, that's directly contrary to—" "I'm aware of what it's contrary to, Lieutenant." Bryce did not look at Sira. He kept his eyes on the hatchling, which had drawn itself into a tighter ball but was still watching him with those impossible golden eyes. "The rest of the eggs now move." For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Bryce could feel the rebellion in the air, could sense the soldiers wrestling with the same conflict that was tearing him apart, the duty they had sworn to obey versus the thing that lived in every human heart, the thing that made them recoil from the murder of something small and helpless and newborn. King Aldrich's orders were law. But standing before them was a creature that had just been born into a world of fire and ash. And it was looking at them with eyes that held more intelligence and emotion than half the courtiers in the capital. Sira moved first. She turned to the soldiers and began issuing commands in a voice that was perfectly, admirably steady. The eggs were collected, the pyres were fed, the work continued. But the hatchling remained on the ground, trembling and gold-eyed and alive, and Bryce Harlow stood over it like a guardian carved from stone. When the last egg had been placed on the pyres and the flames had risen to their terrible height, Bryce knelt down, slowly, carefully. He made himself small, reducing his profile, trying to appear as non-threatening as a man of his size could possibly appear. The hatchling flinched as he reached toward it, its body coiling tighter, its claws digging into the earth. But it did not run. It did not attack. It simply watched as Bryce's hand, scarred and calloused and stained with ash, extended toward it and stopped, hovering in the air a few inches from its snout. "I know," Bryce murmured, and he was not sure if he was speaking to the hatchling or to himself. "I know what I've done, I know what this looks like, but I need you to trust me, just for a moment, just long enough for me to get you out of here." The hatchling's nostrils flared. Bryce could feel the warmth of its breath, surprisingly hot for something so small, and the faint vibration of a sound that was too low for human ears but that he somehow sensed rather than heard. It was evaluating him, assessing him, deciding whether he was a threat or something else. Then, with a movement so delicate that it made Bryce's breath catch, the hatchling stretched its neck forward and pressed its snout against his palm. The contact was electric. Not in the literal sense, there was no spark or shock, but in the way it resonated through every nerve in Bryce's body, lighting up pathways that he hadn't known existed. It was warmth and connection and something ancient, something that reached back through the long centuries to the very first moment a human hand had touched a dragon's snout and two species had looked at each other and recognized something kindred. Bryce's vision blurred. He blinked and a tear tracked down his cheek, cutting a clean line through the ash and grime. He had not wept when his father died, had not wept when he'd carried wounded men off battlefields or when he'd stood over the graves of soldiers who had trusted him with their lives. But this tiny, trembling, impossibly brave creature pressing its nose into his hand as if to say, "I choose you," this broke him open. "Okay," he whispered, "okay." He gathered the hatchling into his arms. It weighed almost nothing, lighter than a sack of grain, lighter than a child, but it filled his arms with a warmth that spread through his entire body like sunrise. The hatchling tucked its head against his chest, its claws curling into the gaps in his armor, and made a sound that was not a cry this time but something softer. Something that resonated in the cavity of his ribs and settled there like an anchor. Bryce stood, the soldiers were watching. Sira was watching. The pyres roared and the smoke billowed and the sky above was a bruised, ugly purple that spoke of a world being unmade. But in Bryce's arms there was warmth and life and a heartbeat that was not human but that beat in perfect rhythm with his own. "Lieutenant Voss," Bryce said, and his voice was steady now, steadier than it had been in 3 days. "I'm going to my quarters. I have a report to write." Sira looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes dropped to the bundle in his arms, to the tip of a black tail that curled around his forearm, to the tiny claw that gripped the edge of his breastplate. Her expression did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes, a door closing, perhaps, or opening. Bryce could not tell which. "Yes, sir," she said, "I'll handle the pyres." She turned away before he could see her face crack. Bryce's quarters were a sparse affair. A single room in the fortress's officer wing, furnished with a narrow bed, a desk, a chair, and a weapon rack that held his sword, his shield, and a bow that he rarely used anymore. The walls were bare stone, cold and unyielding, and the single window looked out over the courtyard where the pyres still burned. He closed the shutters the moment he entered, plunging the room into a darkness that was broken only by the glow of coals in the small hearth. He set the hatchling down on his bed. It immediately tried to burrow into the blankets, its small body still shaking with residual fear and the shock of a world that was too bright, too loud, too full of hatred for something so new to it. Bryce watched it for a moment, his chest aching with a tenderness that he had not felt since he could not remember when, perhaps never. Perhaps this was something new, something that had been born in the same moment as the hatchling itself, emerging from the wreckage of duty and destruction like a flower pushing through cracked stone. He sat on the edge of the bed. The hatchling poked its head out of the blankets, its golden eyes catching the faint red glow of the coals. It looked at him again with that same unnerving intensity, and Bryce found himself holding his breath. "You need a name," he said. The hatchling tilted its head. The gesture was so bird-like, so curious, so utterly innocent that Bryce had to suppress the urge to laugh or sob or both. "Something strong," he continued, mostly because the sound of his own voice seemed to calm the creature. "Something that means surviving when everything else is gone. Something that means, I don't know, refusing to die when the whole world wants you dead." He thought for a moment. The hatchling waited, its eyes never leaving his face. "Ember," Bryce said finally, "because that's what you are, a spark that survived the fire, the last ember of something that was supposed to be gone." Ember, the hatchling made a sound, a soft, trilling chirp that vibrated in Bryce's chest, and he could have sworn that it understood, that it heard the name and accepted it and wrapped it around itself like armor. Bryce reached out and gently stroked the ridge of scales that ran along Ember's spine. They were smoother than he had expected, almost like polished stone and warm beneath his fingertips. Ember arched into the touch, its eyes half closing, and the trembling that had been constant since its hatching began to subside. "I don't know what I'm doing," Bryce admitted to the empty room, to the hatchling, to whatever force in the universe had decided that he of all people was the one who should be standing in this moment. "I'm a soldier. I follow orders. That's what I do. That's all I know how to do. And right now I am standing here with you in my quarters while my king is expecting every last trace of your kind to be reduced to ash, and I have absolutely no idea what comes next." Ember opened one golden eye and looked at him as if to say, "Neither do I, but here we are." Bryce exhaled, a sound that was half laugh, half sigh, and entirely exhausted. "Yeah," he said, "here we are." The knock came at midnight. Bryce had been sitting in the chair beside the bed watching Ember sleep. The hatchling had curled into a tight ball, its tail wrapped around its nose, its breathing slow and rhythmic. In sleep, it looked even smaller than it did awake, impossibly fragile, impossibly precious, like a secret that the world was not worthy of knowing. 3 sharp raps on the door. Bryce was on his feet in an instant, his hand on his sword, his body between the door and the bed. His heart slammed against his ribs. "Who is it?" "Zira." He hesitated, then he crossed the room and opened the door a crack. Sira stood in the corridor, still in her armor, a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. Her face was illuminated by the thin line of torchlight that spilled through the gap, and Bryce could see that her jaw was clenched and her eyes were red-rimmed, though whether from smoke or tears he could not say. "The pyres are out," she said without preamble. "All eggs destroyed. I've filed the report with the quartermaster. 47 eggs from the eastern clutch, 612 total across all 3 days. The numbers match the inventory." She paused, her gaze dropped to the gap between the door and the frame, as if she could see through the wood to the small, sleeping creature on the bed beyond. "You have something in there, Commander." It was not a question. Bryce said nothing, his hand tightened on the door. Sira reached into the satchel and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth. She held it out to him, and when Bryce took it, he found that it was heavy and warm and that it smelled of herbs and something earthy, a mixture that he recognized dimly as the kind of preparation that dragon keepers used to nourish newborn hatchlings. Mixed dried meats, crushed minerals, a paste made from a specific kind of root that grew only in the mountains where the dragons nested. "Where did you get this?" Bryce asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had an aunt in the dragon keepers." Sira's voice was carefully flat, carefully controlled, but Bryce could hear the grief beneath it like an undercurrent. "She died last year, natural causes, before the purge, but she taught me things, what to feed a hatchling, how to keep it warm, how to read its moods." She paused, and something flickered across her face, a pain so raw that it made Bryce's chest tight. "I thought I'd never use any of it. I thought it was just memories. Something to hold on to because she was gone and the dragons were going to be gone too, and I didn't want to forget." She looked at him, and for the first time since he had known her, Sira Voss's careful mask cracked. Her chin trembled, her eyes shone. "Take care of it, Commander," she said, "please." Bryce closed his eyes. When he opened them, he nodded once. "Thank you, Sira." She turned and walked away down the corridor without another word. Her footsteps echoed on the stone and then faded, swallowed by the silence of a fortress that smelled of ash and death and the faint, stubborn warmth of something newly born. The days that followed were the most difficult of Bryce's life, and he had survived the siege of Thornwall, the winter campaign, and a blade wound through his side that had left him bedridden for 2 months. Keeping Ember hidden in a fortress full of soldiers was an exercise in constant, nerve-shredding vigilance. The hatchling was small enough to conceal for now, but it was also a dragon, and dragons were not meant to live in stone boxes. Ember grew quickly. Within a week, the hatchling had doubled in size, its black scales deepening to an even more impossible shade of darkness that seemed to absorb light itself. Its wings, which had been crumpled and useless at hatching, began to strengthen and unfurl, stretching to a span that was already wider than Bryce's outstretched arms. Its golden eyes, which had been enormous and childlike, began to sharpen with an intelligence that was almost unsettling in something so young. And it was hungry, constantly insatiably hungry. The provisions that Syrah had provided lasted less than 4 days, and after that Bryce found himself resorting to increasingly desperate measures, sneaking scraps from the kitchen, ordering extra rations under the pretext of illness, and once, in a moment of pure desperation, catching a rat in the corridor and feeding it to Ember with a grimace that he was glad no one could see. Ember, for its part, seemed to understand the necessity of secrecy. It was quiet during the day, staying hidden in the space beneath Bryce's bed or in the chest at the foot of it, making only the smallest of sounds. But at night, when the fortress settled into the relative quiet of the sleeping hours, Ember would emerge and become something entirely different. It would climb onto Bryce's bed and curl up against his side, its warmth seeping through the blankets like a living furnace. It would make sounds, not the terrified chirping of those first hours, but something richer, more complex, a kind of low, rumbling hum that Bryce came to recognize as contentment. It would press its snout against his hand and hold it there, and Bryce would feel that same electric connection that he had felt in the courtyard, that same sense of two beings reaching across the vast gulf of species and finding common ground in the simple, universal language of trust. And sometimes, when the mood struck it, Ember would sing. It was not a song in the human sense. There were no words, no melody that could be written down or reproduced. It was a series of tones and harmonics that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the hatchling's chest, resonating at frequencies that Bryce felt in his bones rather than heard with his ears. It was mournful and beautiful and ancient, a sound that spoke of fire and flight and skis that stretched to infinity. And when Ember sang, Bryce would close his eyes and see mountains that he had never climbed and valleys that he had never walked and a world that was vast and wild and free, in a way that the cramped, ordered geometry of human civilization could never be. It was the song of a species that was dying, and it was the most beautiful thing Bryce had ever heard. He began to change. He did not notice it at first. The shifts were subtle, creeping, the kind of transformations that are invisible from day to day but undeniable when viewed across weeks. The hollow, numbed feeling that had settled into his chest after the first pyre began to dissipate, replaced by something that he could only describe as purpose. Not the borrowed purpose of following orders that felt thinner than ever, a sheet of paper stretched over an abyss, but something internal, something that belonged to him alone. He started asking questions, quietly, carefully, in ways that would not raise suspicion. He spoke with the older soldiers, the ones who remembered the days when dragons still flew over the kingdom, and he listened to their stories with an attention that he had never given to the official histories. He learned that the dragon keepers had not been merely caretakers. They had been scholars, historians, keepers of a vast body of knowledge about dragon biology, psychology, and culture that had been accumulated over 8 centuries. He learned that the bond between dragon and rider was not a magical artifact or a mystical gift, but a genuine emotional connection, formed through patience and trust and mutual respect, and that it could not be forced or faked. He learned that King Aldrich's purge was not motivated solely by the desire to eliminate a potential threat. There were other factors, economic ones. Dragon territory contained rich mineral deposits that the kingdom's growing industrial complex coveted. The nesting mountains sat atop veins of iron, copper, and something called draconite, a mineral that burned hotter and longer than coal and that the kingdom's engineers were desperate to exploit. Without the dragons in the way, those resources were suddenly available, and the crown's treasury stood to increase by a factor of 10. The dragons were not being destroyed because they were dangerous. They were being destroyed because they were in the way. This knowledge settled into Bryce's bones like a second skeleton, hard and unyielding and impossible to ignore. He looked at the fortress around him, the stone walls built with dragon fire, the iron gates forged in dragon furnaces, the very land that had been defended by dragon blood for 8 centuries, and he saw it all for what it truly was. A monument to ingratitude built on the bones of the creatures who had made it possible. Ember grew. Within 3 weeks, the hatchling was the size of a large dog, its wingspan approaching 6 feet, its scales gleaming with a luster that was almost metallic. It could no longer fit beneath the bed or in the chest. It barely fit in the room. And its presence, that undeniable, irrepressible vitality that radiated from it like heat from a forge, was becoming harder and harder to conceal. Bryce knew that he was running out of time. Sooner or later, someone would notice. A sound, a scent, a glimpse of black scales through a cracked door, and when that happened, the consequences would not fall on him alone. Sira would be implicated. Anyone who had helped him, anyone who had suspected and chosen to remain silent, all of them would be dragged into the wreckage of his defiance. He needed a plan. The plan came to him on a rainy night during one of Ember's singing sessions. The hatchling was perched on the windowsill. It had grown strong enough to fly short distances, and it had taken to roosting on the narrow ledge outside Bryce's window when the weather permitted, and its song was particularly mournful that night, threaded with tones that Bryce had come to recognize as longing. Longing for open sky, for the mountains, for a world that was not made of stone and suspicion. Bryce listened, and as he listened, he thought about the mountains, about the vast uncharted wilderness that lay beyond the kingdom's eastern border, the Ironback Range, where the peaks rose so high that their tops were lost in cloud even in summer, and where the valleys were deep and green and untouched by human ambition. It was there that the last of the wild dragons had fled when the purge began. It was there, if anywhere, that Ember might find others of its kind. It was also, Bryce knew, across 300 miles of hostile territory. The border was heavily patrolled. Aldrich had increased the garrisons along every frontier in anticipation of resistance from the dragon sympathizers that he knew still existed within the kingdom. The roads were watched. The wilderness was scouted. And traveling with a dragon, even a young one, was the definition of conspicuous. But it was the only way. Bryce spent the next 2 days preparing. He gathered supplies: dried meat, water skins, a bedroll, a compass, a map that he copied from the fortress's archives by candlelight while the quartermaster slept. He arranged his armor and weapons, selecting only what was essential: his sword, a hunting knife, a bow, and a quiver of arrows. He wrote letters, one to the garrison commander, requesting a leave of absence on grounds of personal matters, and one to Sira, which contained only 3 words: "Thank you, run." He did not know if Sira would understand. He hoped she would. On the 3rd night, when the moon was hidden behind thick clouds and the rain was falling hard enough to mask the sound of footsteps, Bryce opened his window and looked out at the darkness. Ember was already there. The young dragon had grown attuned to Bryce's moods with an accuracy that was almost telepathic, and it seemed to sense that something was different tonight. It stood on the windowsill with its wings half spread, its golden eyes luminous in the dark, its entire body vibrating with a tension that was not fear but anticipation. "Ready?" Bryce asked softly. Ember chirped. It was the same sound it had made when Bryce had given it a name, that trilling, vibrating note that resonated in his chest, but richer now, deeper, colored with a confidence that the tiny, trembling hatchling in the courtyard could never have mustered. Bryce swung his leg over the windowsill. The rain hit him like a wall of cold needles, and the wind nearly tore him from his grip on the stone frame. Below, the courtyard was a river of mud and shadow, and the walls of the fortress rose up like the sides of a grave. He looked at Ember. Ember looked at him. And in those golden eyes, Bryce saw something that he had seen in the eyes of soldiers before a charge, that wild, reckless, magnificent acceptance of impossibility that was the closest thing humans had to dragon fire. "Let's go," Bryce said. He dropped from the window. The fall was 15 feet, and he hit the mud with a jolt that sent pain shooting through his ankles and knees. But he rolled, came up running, and did not look back. Behind him, he heard the whisper of wings, leathery and powerful and utterly silent, and then Ember was beside him, flying low through the rain, a shadow within shadows, its black scales rendering it nearly invisible against the night. They reached the outer wall in minutes. Bryce had walked this route 100 times during his tenure at the fortress, had noted every guard post, every blind spot, every shadow that could hide a man in motion. He pressed himself against the cold stone and waited for the patrol to pass. 3 soldiers, hunched against the rain, more interested in getting out of the weather than in watching for escapees. When they had passed, Bryce scaled the wall using the handholds he had identified during his weeks of careful observation, hauled himself over the top, and dropped into the drainage ditch on the far side. Ember glided down beside him, landing with a grace that Bryce envied. The young dragon shook its wings, sending a spray of rainwater in all directions, and then looked at Bryce with an expression that he could only describe as amused. "Not a word," Bryce muttered. They ran. The first 3 days were the worst. The rain did not let up. It fell in sheets, in curtains, in relentless bone-soaking torrents that turned the roads into rivers and the fields into bogs. Bryce's boots filled with water within the first hour and stayed full for the duration. His cloak, which he had thought would provide adequate protection, became a sodden weight that clung to his shoulders and chafed his neck raw. His supplies, wrapped in oilcloth, stayed mostly dry, but the constant damp seeped into everything: his food, his bedding, his map, his bones. Ember, by contrast, seemed to thrive in the rain. The young dragon flew ahead of Bryce during the day, scouting the route, checking for patrols, and returning to report in a series of chirps and trills that Bryce had learned to interpret with surprising accuracy. 2 chirps meant the path was clear. 3 meant danger ahead: soldiers, usually, or sometimes villagers who might raise an alarm. A long, low hum meant that Ember had found shelter: a cave, an abandoned building, a dense thicket where they could rest without being seen. At night, they huddled together for warmth, Ember's body radiating heat like a furnace while Bryce pressed against the dragon's side and tried to ignore the ache in his legs and the throb in his ankles and the small, persistent voice in the back of his mind that whispered that he was insane, that he was throwing away his career, his reputation, his life for a creature that the entire kingdom had declared an enemy. But then Ember would shift in its sleep, curling its tail more tightly around him, and that small, persistent voice would go quiet. Because Bryce knew with a certainty that went beyond logic and beyond duty and beyond everything he had ever been taught about loyalty and obedience, that what he was doing was right. Not right in the legal sense, not right in the political sense, not right in any way that the courts of King Aldrich would recognize or condone, but right in the way that mattered. Right in the way that a man standing in a burning building and choosing to save a child instead of a suitcase of gold is right. Right in the way that a soldier lowering his weapon and refusing to fire on civilians is right. Right in the deep, unshakable, bone-level way that cannot be argued with or legislated away. On the 4th day, the rain stopped. The clouds broke apart like shattered glass, and the sun poured through the gaps with a warmth and brilliance that made Bryce gasp. He stood on a hilltop, dripping and mud-stained and exhausted, and looked out at the landscape spread before him. It was beautiful. Rolling green hills dotted with wildflowers, threaded with silver streams that sparkled in the sunlight, stretching eastward toward the dark, jagged line of the Ironback Range. The mountains were still distant, at least a week's travel away, but they were there, solid and real and immense, rising from the earth like the spine of some primordial creature. And somewhere in those mountains, if the scouts' reports were to be believed, the last wild dragons had made their home. Ember landed on the hilltop beside him and spread its wings to their full extent. In the sunlight, the dragon's black scales shimmered with an iridescence that Bryce had never seen before, hints of deep purple and midnight blue that rippled across its body like oil on water. It was stunning, magnificent. A creature that should have been soaring above mountains and diving through clouds, not hiding in fortresses and fleeing through rain. Ember turned its head toward the mountains. Its golden eyes narrowed, and from its throat came a sound that Bryce had never heard, a long, piercing cry that echoed across the hills and seemed to hang in the air long after it faded. It was not a song. It was not a chirp or a trill or a hum. It was a call, a declaration, a signal sent out into the vast, empty sky, addressed to any of its kind who might be listening. There was no answer. The hills remained silent, the mountains distant and unknowable. But Ember stood with its wings spread and its head held high, and Bryce could see in its posture a defiance that mirrored his own, a refusal to accept that the silence was permanent, a belief that somewhere beyond the horizon there were others. They pressed on. The trouble found them on the 6th day in the form of a border patrol. Bryce had known that the border would be the most dangerous part of the journey. The kingdom's eastern frontier was guarded by a string of fortifications known as the Aldrich Line, a series of watchtowers and garrison posts connected by a cleared corridor of land that offered no cover for anyone attempting to cross undetected. The corridor was 100 yards wide and patrolled around the clock by soldiers who had standing orders to shoot first and ask questions never. Bryce had been hopping to find a gap, a stretch of the line that was poorly guarded or temporarily understaffed, but as he and Ember crept to the edge of the tree line and looked out at the cleared corridor, his heart sank. The towers were fully manned, the patrols were regular and vigilant, and the corridor itself was a churned mess of mud and horse tracks that would betray any footprint left in it. "We'll have to go over," Bryce murmured, more to himself than to Ember. "At night, when the moon is down." Ember, who had been lying beside him with its body pressed flat against the ground to minimize its profile, shifted and looked at him with an expression that Bryce had come to think of as, "Are you sure about that?" It was a remarkably human expression for a dragon, and Bryce had to suppress a smile. "I'm sure," he said. "You can carry me, can't you?" Ember's expression shifted to something that Bryce could only describe as offended. The dragon spread one wing, displaying its full impressive span, and gave a soft huff that clearly communicated, "What do you think?" Bryce raised an eyebrow. "You've never carried a person before." Ember's wing folded back. Its golden eyes held his for a long moment. Then it extended a claw and carefully, deliberately traced a mark in the dirt at Bryce's feet, a shape that looked vaguely like a dragon with a smaller figure on its back. Bryce stared at it, then at Ember, then back at the shape in the dirt. "You can write," he said, his voice cracking with disbelief. Ember huffed again, more offended this time. It then proceeded to draw another shape in the dirt, a series of lines and curves that Bryce did not recognize but that looked far too complex to be the idle scratchings of an animal. "I'll take that as a yes," Bryce said faintly. He spent the rest of the day hiding in the tree line with Ember, watching the patrols and timing their routes. The pattern was regular, a patrol every 15 minutes along the corridor, with each patrol consisting of 4 soldiers on horseback. The watchtowers had archers with clear lines of sight, but their attention was focused on the corridor itself, not on the sky above it. If Ember could fly high enough and fast enough, they might be able to clear the line without being spotted. Might, it was a thin word to hang a life on, but it was all Bryce had. They waited for full dark. The moon, which had been waxing, set around midnight, and Bryce used those last hours to prepare. He stripped off his armor, too heavy, too noisy, and secured his sword across his back. He tied his supplies into a compact bundle that he could strap to Ember's harness, using a makeshift arrangement of leather straps that he had fashioned from his belt and the remnants of his cloak. At midnight, with the sky above as black as Ember's scales, Bryce climbed onto the dragon's back. It was an awkward, undignified process. Ember was still young, barely a month old, though its growth had been astonishing, and its back was not yet broad enough to provide a comfortable seat. Bryce gripped the base of Ember's wings with his thighs and wrapped his arms around the dragon's neck, pressing his face against the warm, smooth scales. "Hold on," he said, and then realized how absurd the words were. "I mean, I'll hold on, you just fly straight across. As fast as you can, don't stop for anything." Ember's response was to crouch low, gather its powerful hind legs beneath it, and launch itself into the night sky with a force that nearly tore Bryce from its back. The world dropped away, the tree line, the cleared corridor, the watchtowers with their flickering lanterns, and suddenly they were airborne, rising with a speed that stole Bryce's breath and turned his stomach inside out. Wind, roaring, tearing, howling wind that screamed past his ears and tore at his clothes and tried relentlessly to pry him from Ember's back. Bryce clung with every ounce of strength he possessed, his fingers digging into the ridges of Ember's neck, his legs locked around the dragon's body with a grip that would leave bruises for weeks. Below him, the ground was a black void, invisible and terrifying, and above him the stars were cold and indifferent and infinitely far away. And then Ember leveled out, and the wind became a steady rush instead of a chaotic assault, and Bryce dared to open his eyes. The world was spread beneath him like a tapestry. He could see the Aldrich line, the cleared corridor, a pale scar across the dark landscape, the watchtower's pinpricks of light, the patrol's tiny, slow-moving shadows. He could see beyond the line into the wild territory that marked the beginning of the no-man's land between the kingdom and the Ironback Range. Hills and forests and rivers, all silvered by starlight, all stretching toward the distant mountains that rose like a wall against the eastern horizon. They were above the line. They were past the first tower. The second tower was coming up fast, and Bryce could see the archer on its platform, a dark shape against the lantern light, turning to look up at. An arrow sang through the air. It missed Ember by less than a foot, slicing through the membrane of the dragon's left wing with a sound like tearing silk. Ember shrieked, a wild, pain-filled cry that echoed across the sky, and its wing faltered, the left side dipping sharply. Bryce felt the dragon's body twist beneath him, felt the horrible, lurching sensation of controlled flight becoming a desperate spiral, and he knew with cold certainty that if Ember went down in the corridor, they were both dead. "Fly," Bryce shouted into the wind, his voice ripped away almost before it left his mouth. "Fly." Ember flew. Despite the torn wing, despite the pain, despite the arrow that was now protruding from the membrane like a gruesome splinter, the young dragon drove its wings with a fury that Bryce felt in every muscle of his body, and the spiral stabilized, and they surged forward, climbing, climbing, climbing until the watchtowers were tiny dots and the arrows, two more neither close, were harmless wisps against the vastness of the sky. They flew for an hour after that, putting as much distance between themselves and the Aldrich line as possible. Ember's wing bled, the dark blood trailing behind them like a banner, and its flight was uneven, a slight listing to the left that Bryce could feel in the rhythm of the wing beats. But it did not stop. It did not falter again. It flew with a stubborn, ferocious determination that made Bryce's throat tight and his eyes sting. And when it finally descended into a dense forest and folded its wings with a gasp that was almost human in its exhaustion, Bryce slid from its back and sank to his knees in the leaf litter. "Let me see," he said, his hands already moving to examine the wing. The tear was significant, a gash about 6 inches long through the thin membrane that connected the wing's structural bones. Blood flowed freely, dark and hot, and Ember flinched and hissed as Bryce's fingers probed the edges of the wound. "I'm sorry," Bryce murmured. "I'm sorry, I have to clean it." He worked through the night, using water from his skin and strips torn from his already ruined cloak to clean and bind the wound. Ember endured the process with a stoicism that belied its young age, making only small sounds of pain when the cleaning was particularly intense. By dawn, the wing was bandaged as well as Bryce could manage, and Ember was asleep on the forest floor, its body curled around itself, its breathing slow and deep. Bryce sat beside the sleeping dragon and watched the sunrise paint the forest in shades of gold and green. His hands were covered in blood, Ember's blood, dark and warm and irrefutably real. It was the blood of a creature that the king had declared non-person, non-entity, non-worthy of existence. And as Bryce looked at it, staining his fingers and seeping into the earth beneath him, he felt something crystallize inside his chest, something hard and bright and unbreakable. He had crossed a line, not the Aldrich line, though he had crossed that too, but a deeper, more fundamental line. The line between obedience and conscience, between the man who followed orders and the man who followed his heart. He could not go back. He did not want to go back. Whatever lay ahead, the wilderness, the mountains, the uncertainty of a future with no plan and no kingdom and no identity beyond fugitive. It was better than what lay behind. Because behind him was a world that burned the eggs of innocent creatures and called it justice. Behind him was a king who valued gold above life and control above freedom. Behind him was a version of himself that he could no longer bear to be. Ahead of him was a dragon with a torn wing and golden eyes full of trust. Ahead of him was enough. They reached the Ironbark Range 9 days later. 9 days of walking through wilderness that became progressively wilder, more rugged, more beautiful. 9 days of watching Ember's wing heal, slowly, agonizingly slowly, but surely, the torn membrane knitting together with a resilience that bordered on miraculous. 9 days of learning each other's rhythms and moods and needs, of developing a communication that was part sound, part gesture, part something else entirely. That same electric connection that Bryce had felt the moment Ember's snout had touched his palm in the courtyard, grown stronger and deeper with every passing day. By the time the mountains rose before them in their full, staggering immensity, Ember was flying again short distances at first, then longer ones as the wings strengthened and the bandages came off. And on the morning of the 9th day, as they stood at the base of the tallest peak and looked up at its cloud-wreathed summit, Ember launched itself into the sky and flew in a wide, glorious circle around the mountainside, its restored wings catching the sunlight and scattering it like a prism, its cry echoing off the stone walls and filling the valleys with a sound that was pure, undiluted joy. Bryce watched and smiled, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that might have been happiness. They climbed. The ascent took 2 days, through forests of pine and cedar that gave way to bare rock and thin air, and cold that bit at Bryce's exposed skin like a living thing. Ember, whose dragon physiology was far better suited to the altitude, flew ahead and then circled back, as if impatient with Bryce's slower, human pace. On the 2nd day, they found the cave. It was not a small cave. It was enormous, a gaping wound in the mountainside, tall enough to accommodate a creature the size of a house, deep enough that the darkness within seemed absolute and infinite. The entrance was marked with scratches on the stone, deep, parallel gouges that Bryce recognized as dragon claws. And the air that flowed from the cave's mouth was warm, heated by something deep within the mountain, carrying with it a scent that was smoke and mineral and something else, something wild and ancient and unmistakable. Dragon! Ember went rigid. Its wings spread, its body tensed, and its golden eyes blazed with an intensity that Bryce had never seen. From its throat came that same piercing cry that it had uttered on the hilltop days ago, but louder now, more urgent, more desperate. A call thrown into the darkness, a question flung at the void. Is anyone there? Is anyone left? Am I alone? The silence that followed was the longest moment of Bryce's life. And then from deep within the cave, from the depths of the mountain itself, came an answer. It was a sound that Bryce felt before he heard, a vibration in the ground, in the air, in the marrow of his bones. A low, resonant rumble that built in intensity until it was a roar, and then beyond a roar, and then something else entirely, something that was not a sound but a presence, a force, a vast and ancient consciousness that pressed against Bryce's mind like a wave against a shore. Ember screamed, not in fear, in recognition, in joy, in a relief so overwhelming that it manifested as sound because there was no other way for it to escape. From the darkness of the cave, a dragon emerged. It was enormous, larger than anything Bryce had ever seen, larger than the illustrations in the old books, larger than his mind could comfortably process. Its scales were a deep, burnished copper, weathered and scarred by centuries of life, and its eyes the color of molten iron, fixed on Ember with an expression that Bryce could only describe as awe. The copper dragon lowered its massive head until it was level with Ember, who was trembling again, but not with fear this time, with something far more powerful. The two dragons regarded each other, and the air between them hummed with a communication that Bryce could not access but could feel, a vast and complex exchange of information and emotion that flowed like a river between their minds. Then the copper dragon raised its head and looked at Bryce. The weight of that gaze was staggering. Those iron-colored eyes, ancient and deep and filled with a wisdom that dwarfed anything human, settled on him with a directness that made him feel utterly transparent. He knew in that moment that the dragon was reading him not his surface thoughts but his essence, his core, the fundamental truth of who he was and why he was here. There was no deception possible in the face of that gaze, no pretense, no defense. Bryce stood his ground. He did not bow, did not grovel, did not avert his eyes. He met the copper dragon's stare with everything he had, the guilt and the grief and the determination and the love, all of it, raw and unfiltered and real. The copper dragon held his gaze for a long, measured moment. Then it shifted its attention back to Ember, and the corner of its massive mouth lifted in what might have been a smile. It spoke, not in words. Bryce could not have understood dragon's speech even if such a thing existed, but in a series of deep, resonant tones that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and arrive directly in his chest. He did not understand the meaning of the sounds, but he understood their intent. It was welcome. It was acknowledgement. It was something that, in the human language that Bryce had spent his life speaking, might have been translated as, "You brought one home, you brought one of ours home." Ember pressed its body against the copper dragon's leg, a gesture so small and so tender against that immense bulk that it made Bryce's eyes burn. The copper dragon curled its tail around the young dragon protectively, and the two of them stood there, ancient and new, survivor and newborn, the last in the future in the warm air that flowed from the cave's mouth. And Bryce Harlow, the soldier who had burned dragon eggs for 3 days and then had refused to burn one more, who had carried a hatchling in his arms through rain and darkness and across a kingdom that wanted it dead, who had crossed the line and left his old self behind and walked into an unknown future with nothing but a torn cloak and a sword and a heart that was finally, fully his own. Bryce stood and watched, and felt deep in the place where the electric connection lived, a warmth that was not embers alone but something larger, something shared, something that was beginning between two dragons and expanding outward to include him, the human who had chosen differently. He did not know what came next. He did not know if the wild dragons would accept him, if he could survive in the mountains, if King Aldrich's hunters would eventually find him, if anything he had done would matter in the end. The future was as unknown and as vast as the sky that Ember had carried him through. But he knew one thing with a certainty that burned brighter than any pyre. One dragon hatchling had refused to be destroyed. And one human had refused to destroy it. And in a world that had decided that extinction was acceptable, that obedience was more important than compassion, that power was more valuable than life, that refusal was everything. That refusal was the seed from which something new might grow, something that the king and his armies and his laws and his greed could not touch, because it was not built from stone or steel or the cheap currency of fear. It was built from trust, from the touch of a snout against a palm, from a song in the dark, from the simple, radical, world-changing decision to look at something small and helpless and different and say, "Not this one, not today, not evers." The copper dragon turned its iron gaze on Bryce one final time, and in that gaze, Bryce saw something that he had not expected. He saw gratitude. Not the kind of gratitude that humans expressed, not words or gestures or debts to be repaid, but something deeper, something that acknowledged the cost of what he had done and honored it without diminishing it. The dragon saw him, truly saw him, and what it saw was not a soldier or a fugitive or a traitor or a hero. It saw a human who had chosen. That was enough, that was more than enough, that was everything. Bryce stepped forward past the threshold of the cave, into the warmth and the darkness and the unknown. Ember trotted beside him, its golden eyes bright, its torn wing held high, its small body radiating a heat that had nothing to do with dragon physiology and everything to do with the simple, indestructible power of being alive. Behind them, the copper dragon followed, its massive form filling the cave entrance with shadow and fire. And as it crossed the threshold, it spoke one more time, a single resonant tone that echoed through the mountain and out into the world beyond. A sound that carried in it the weight of a dying species and the defiance of a newborn one and the stubborn, unyielding, magnificent refusal to go quietly into the dark. The mountains heard it, the sky heard it. And somewhere far to the west, in a fortress that smelled of ash and a kingdom built on bones, a king who thought himself a god heard it too, faintly, distantly, like a whisper at the edge of a dream. And in his gilded throne room, King Aldrich Valdris IV felt something that he had not felt in a very long time. Fear. Because the fires had been burning for 3 days, and they had not been enough. One ember had survived. And embers, as every fool knows, have a way of starting fires of their own.